There are moments in a man's life when the universe conspires to remind him just how small and magnificent he truly is, all at the same time. Before we dive deeper into the story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The red dust of New Meridian stretched out like a wound across the face of the planet Kessa-4, a world so far from Earth that its sun rose the color of bruised copper, and its nights carried two moons that chased each other across an endless indigo sky. This was the frontier, not the romantic kind you used to write about in old Western novels, but the brutal, exhausting, magnificent kind that only people with nothing left to lose ever found themselves standing in the middle of. Cole Harrell was one of those people. 53 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been cracked and healed so many times they looked like topographical maps of forgotten mountain ranges. His hair was the color of iron dust, and his eyes, dark gray, impossibly steady, had seen enough of the galaxy to be permanently and quietly tired. He ran the Kessa-4 agricultural station alone. 200 head of genetically modified bison cattle hybrids, a greenhouse dome the size of a football stadium, a water reclamation tower that grumbled every morning like a diesel engine from the previous century, and exactly 0 neighbors within 40 kilometers. That was the way Cole wanted it. He had served 22 years in the United Earth Expeditionary Corps, had fought in 3 planetary skirmishes, had lost people, good people whose names he recited himself every night before sleep, because he was afraid that if he stopped saying them aloud, the universe would forget they ever existed. Then he had come here, to the quiet, to the red dust, to a life that asked nothing of him except labor and attention, and the willingness to get up each morning and do it all again. The supply shuttle landed on the 4th Tuesday of the cycle, same as always, kicking up a tornado of red dust that swept across the loading dock and sent Cole squinting behind the reinforced visor of his work helmet. The shuttle was an old Callaway-class freighter, the kind with a belly ramp that groaned like an injured animal every time it lowered. Cole stood with his arms folded across his chest, clipboard terminal in one hand, watching the ramp descend and waiting for the usual crates of Hydra nutrients, equipment parts, and a monthly communication package from Colonial Administration Bureau, which inevitably contained 3 forms he needed to fill out, 2 requests for data he had already sent twice, and 1 cheerful reminder about the importance of maintaining positive relationships with neighboring settlements, of which Cole had precisely none. What he was not waiting for was a person. She came down the ramp behind a cargo loader drone, stepping carefully over a stray cable and shading her eyes against Kessa Ivy's copper sun. She was young. That was the first thing Cole registered. The kind of young that still carried a faint bewilderment about the world, as if the universe had not yet shown her all its teeth. Maybe 26, 27 at most. She wore the standard issue gray and blue field uniform of the Colonial Science Division, but she had modified it. A strip of deep green fabric wrapped around one wrist, a small hand-painted symbol on her helmet that he did not recognize. The kind of personalizations that told you someone had been somewhere long enough to start making things their own. She had dark skin the color of rich, river-bottom earth, and her hair was pulled back in a tight series of coils. She carried a battered equipment case in one hand and a data pad in the other, and she was looking at everything. The red dust, the greenhouse dome catching the light, the distant silhouette of the water tower. With the wide, Cole watched her for a moment, then looked back at the shuttle crew, who were already moving cargo with the efficient disinterest of people who had dropped off enough colonists to know that they were not responsible for what happened next. "You the rancher?" she called across the dock, her voice carrying easily over the wind. It was a clear voice, precise, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had trained themselves to be heard in difficult environments. "I am," Cole said. He did not move. She came the rest of the way toward him with a confidence that his instincts told him was partly genuine and partly performed. The walk of someone who had learned that if you move like you belonged somewhere, most people assumed you did. She stopped 3 feet away and extended her hand. "Dr. Yarsen, Xenobotanical Survey Division, Colonial Science Corps." She paused. "I'm your new field research partner, attached to the station for the next 18 months. Cole looked at her hand, then at her, then at the data pad she was holding. "Nobody told me about this. Somebody told the Colonial Administration Bureau." Yara said, a slight edge of humor in her voice. "They sent the assignment 14 weeks ago. I have the confirmation code." She tilted the datapad toward him. Cole took it, scanned it, and felt the particular slow frustration of a man who had, in fact, received a notification and filed in the bottom of a digital folder under the reasonable assumption that something would fall through. Nothing had fallen through. The Colonial Administration Bureau, for once in its bureaucratic life, had followed up. He handed the datapad back, without a word. "There's a second bunk in the East module," he said. "Shower cycle runs at 0600 and 1800. Meals are when you make them. I work from sunup to 2 hours past sundown. What you do with the rest of the hours is your business, as long as it doesn't interfere with station operations." Yara nodded, absorbing all of this with the calm attention of someone taking field notes. Understood. She looked out across the red dust plain, toward the low hills that marked the edge of the native vegetation zone. Ancient, rust-colored plants that had evolved over millions of years to survive on a world that sometimes felt like it was trying to scourge life altogether. "I'll need access to the vegetation perimeter," she said. "I'm documenting the interaction between terrestrial agricultural transplants and Kessa native species. The working hypothesis is that some of the native root systems may have developed a form of chemical communication that's been partially disrupting your crop yields." Cole was quiet for a moment. He had noticed the yield disruption. It had cost him 6% of his last harvest. He had attributed it to soil mineral fluctuation. "You think the native plants are talking to my crops?" he said. Yara looked at him steadily. "I think everything is talking to everything," she said. "We're just usually too loud to hear it." He did not have a response to that. He turned and walked toward the station entrance. "I'll give you the perimeter access code after orientation." The first 3 months were professional. Correct. The way two people inhabit a shared space when they are both determined not to need each other. Cole moved through his days with the practiced efficiency of long solitude. Up before the copper sun, maintenance round of the greenhouse, feeding cycles to the herd, water reclamation checks, endless small repairs on equipment that was never quite new enough to be reliable. Yara was out in the vegetation zone most days from sunrise, returning in the early afternoon to run samples in the portable lab she had set up in the station's secondary workspace. They shared meals with the quiet ease of people who had both spent significant time alone and therefore did not feel the pressure to fill silence with noise. Sometimes they talked about the work, sometimes not at all. He noticed things about her the way he noticed everything, carefully, without intending to, the way she kept a handwritten journal in addition to her digital records, moving a real pen across real paper with an intensity that suggested the act mattered beyond the words. The way she spoke to her samples under her breath, a habit she seemed unaware of, low-murmured commentary as she worked. The way she stood at the east-facing window at night sometimes and watched the 2 moons rise, not with the romantic wonder of someone new to frontier, but with a steady, serious attention. He noticed that she was capable, not in a way that surprised him. He had known enough people to understand that competence comes in all varieties, but in the specific, quiet way that meant she did not need to be noticed being capable. She solved problems as they appeared. She adapted without complaint. When the portable lab's power regulator failed during a particularly important sample run, she rebuilt it from station spare parts in 3 hours without asking for help or making any drama about it. When one of the herd got loose and ran 3 kilometers into the native vegetation zone during an electrical storm, she was the one who found it, following the chemical trail markers in the vegetation with a skill that Cole could not help admiring. The conversation that changed something, though neither of them would have called it at a time, happened on a night in the 4th month, when one of Kessa IV's rare atmospheric events pushed green auroras across the sky in curtains of cold light. Cole was sitting outside on the loading dock steps with a cup of synthesized coffee that was acceptable if you had low standards, which he had trained himself to have years ago. Yara appeared in the doorway, then came and sat a few steps below him, pulling her knees up and tilting her face toward the aurora. "My grandmother used to say that light like that is the universe's memory," she said, after a long quiet. She was from a family that lived on the water stations in the Pacific archipelago, back on Earth. She'd never seen anything like Kessan auroras, but she had a cosmology for everything. "The universe keeps records," she said, "in light." Cole looked at the aurora. "What does it record?" "Everything that mattered," Yara said. "Everything that was felt." She paused. I used to think that was a beautiful story with no scientific basis. Now I'm not so sure. The chemical signals in the Kesson root networks, they're not random. They carry patterns. Patterns that repeat over geological timescales. The native plants have been having the same conversation for millions of years. She turned and looked up at him. What if memory is just pattern persistence? What if the universe actually does remember? Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about the names he recited every night. The people he had lost, the specific weight of each name, the way saying them felt like placing a stone on a grave to keep it from being forgotten. I don't know if the universe remembers, he said finally, but I think some people do. And maybe that's enough. Yara looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, something careful and open at once. Then she turned back to the Aurora. They sat there for another hour without speaking, and it was the most comfortable Cole had felt in years. The crisis arrived in the 6th month, as crises on the frontier tend to do, without warning, without courtesy, in the middle of the night. Cole was woken at 2 hours past midnight by the station's proximity alarm, a sound he had never heard in 3 years of running the station. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, moving through the dark corridor toward the operations room with the trained speed of someone whose body remembered how to respond to emergencies even when his mind was still catching up. Yara was already there, seated at the communications terminal with her hair loose and her expression so tightly controlled that Cole knew immediately it was serious. On the main display, a contact signature was moving through Kessa IV's upper atmosphere. Not a colonial shuttle, not a survey drone, not anything in the registry of recognized vessels. It was large, approximately 800 meters along its primary axis, shaped in a configuration that did not match any design principle Cole had ever studied or fought against. It's been in the system for 6 hours, Yara said, without turning from the terminal. The Colonial Administration Bureau's automated alert system flagged it. They've sent a priority communication. She finally turned and looked at him. Her eyes were steady but wide. Cole, I think it's a first contact event. Cole sat down slowly in the chair beside her. He had been in the Corps long enough to know that first contact was a scenario that every military and scientific organization in the United Earth colonies had been preparing for, arguing about, theorizing about, and secretly dreading for 200 years. Now, it was apparently happening above a cattle ranch on a frontier agricultural planet, because the universe, in Cole's experience, had never cared about timing or convenience. Have they responded to contact protocols? Cole asked. Not to our standard frequencies, Yara said. But look at this. She pulled up a secondary display, showing a spectral analysis of a signal emanating from the vessel. This is a chemical signal, a molecular communication. Cole, it matches the pattern structure of the Kesson root network signals. Not exactly, but structurally. The grammar is the same. Cole stared at the display for a long moment, understanding arriving slowly. They've been here before, he said. I think they've been here for millions of years, Yara said. I think the Kesson plant network isn't just communication between plants. I think it's a message they left, a long-term signal beacon, encoded in biology because biology persists when technology decays. Her voice was absolutely steady, but her hands, Cole noticed, were trembling slightly. And I think my research is the reason they came back now. My sampling and analysis protocol. I've been essentially reading the signal, responding to it. They may have detected my interaction with their archive. The weight of that settled over the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. You woke them up, Cole said. It was not an accusation. It was simply the shape of the situation. The Colonial Administration Bureau's emergency protocol required the nearest colonial official to maintain position and await a designated contact team from Earth, a journey of approximately 19 days at maximum transit speed. That meant Cole and Yara were alone with the situation for 19 days. The vessel in orbit did not move closer. It did not respond to standard communication frequencies. But every 6 hours, it broadcast the same molecular signal pattern, patient and unwavering, like a question asked in a language that was waiting to be understood. Yara worked. She worked with an intensity that Cole had not seen in her before, a focused desperation that she channeled entirely into her research. cross-referencing her 18 months of sample data, building a decryption framework for the signal patterns, mapping the grammar of a communication system that was simultaneously ancient and precise. Cole kept the station running, kept the herd fed, kept the infrastructure operational, and watched it with the quiet attention he gave to everything on the frontier that required understanding before it required action. On the fourth day, she found a repeating sub-pattern in the signal that she believed constituted a directional component. "They're telling us where to look," she said, pulling up a map of the vegetation zone. "There's a location, about 12 kilometers northeast. The route network signal density there is off the charts. I never went that far out because it was outside my approved survey parameters." She looked at Cole. "I need to go there." Cole did not hesitate. "We go together," he said. That was all. The 12-kilometer trek through the Kesson vegetation zone was unlike any territory Cole had crossed before, and he had crossed a great deal of it. The plants grew denser as they moved northeast, the rust-colored fronds giving way to towering, multi-limbed structures with surfaces that caught the light differently, as if the material of their outer layers were engineered rather than evolved. Too precisely geometric, too uniformly reflective. Yara was vibrating with controlled excitement, her scanner working constantly, recording everything. Cole walked with the measured alertness of long military experience, watching the terrain, watching the sky, watching perimeter of what he could know. What they found at the 12-kilometer mark stopped them both completely. It was a clearing, roughly circular, approximately 40 meters in diameter, and in its center was a structure, not a natural formation, not geological. A structure, rising 8 meters from the red Kesson soil, composed of material that did not catch the light so much as hold it, a deep charcoal gray with interior luminosity, like something alive. Its surface was covered in the same pattern geometry as the molecular signals. Its base was threaded through with the root networks of every native plant in the surrounding vegetation zone, connected with a precision that suggested the plants had grown around it deliberately over geological time, or possibly that the plants themselves had been engineered to grow around it. It was a terminal, a reading station, a physical interface for the biological archive that covered half the planet. Yara stood before it in absolute silence for almost a full minute. Then she reached out and pressed her hand flat against the surface. The structure responded immediately. The interior luminosity shifted, brightened, and the molecular signal broadcast from the vessel above shifted in frequency. The same pattern, but higher, faster, more urgent. And then, from somewhere inside the structure, from somewhere Cole could not locate with any of his 5 senses, from somewhere that seemed to be located slightly outside the physical space they were standing in, came a sound. Not a mechanical sound, not a transmitted audio signal, a voice, or something close enough to a voice that the human brain defaulted to that interpretation, speaking in patterns that Cole's ears registered as language without comprehending any of it. Yara was recording everything. Her hands were steady now. Her expression was the most purely focused Cole had ever seen a human face become. She spoke back to the terminal, slowly, clearly, using the molecular signal grammar she had been constructing, not with scanner but with her actual voice. Pronunciation shaped by a month of intimate contact with the patterns, an intuition developed from a kind of dedicated listening that most scientists would not have known to pursue. The voice responded. Cole stood 6 feet behind her, his hand resting instinctively near the sidearm he had brought, though he understood that the sidearm was irrelevant. Whatever was happening here was beyond the jurisdiction of weapons. He was watching the back of Yara's head, the straightness of her spine, the way she stood before something completely unknown with a steadiness that was not the absence of fear, but the deliberate choosing of something greater than fear. He thought of the people he had lost in 3 planetary wars, wars over resources and territory, and the specific human arrogance of believing that the galaxy was simply waiting to be carved up. He thought of how much smaller all of it seemed, standing in a clearing on a frontier ranch planet, listening to someone speak the first words of dialogue between humanity and whatever had come before. Yara turned to look at him over her shoulder. There were tears on her face, which she did not appear to notice. "They want to know," she said, her voice rough with emotion, "if we are the ones who have been listening." She paused. "I told them yes." The contact team arrived on day 19 as promised, 12 specialists, 2 military escorts, a delegation representative from the Colonial Administration Bureau, and enough equipment to fill half the greenhouse. The Kessin terminal became the center of an operation that Cole watched from the margins with the quiet detachment of someone who understood exactly what their role in the larger story was. He had been the custodian of the place. He had made sure it was still standing when it needed to be. He had walked 12 kilometers through alien terrain beside someone who had the gift to hear what he could not. And he had been steady enough that she could do what she needed to do. The Colonial Administration Bureau representative, a soft-handed man named Fader, who had clearly never been further from Earth than Mars before this assignment, informed Cole formally that the Kessa 4 Agricultural Station was being reassigned as a first contact research site, and that his lease would be terminated with full compensation under Section 14 of the Frontier Settlement Agreement. Cole accepted this with the same expression he used for everything. It was Yara who found him that evening, sitting on the loading dock steps with his second cup of synthesized coffee, watching the vessel in orbit catch the last copper light of the setting sun. She sat down beside him, not a few steps below, as she had before, but beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I tried to get them to maintain your operational status," she said, "as station manager. They said it wasn't consistent with research site protocols." "It's all right," Cole said. "It's not," she said, and there was a fierceness in her voice that made him look at her. "This is your place. You built this. You kept it running. If you hadn't been here for 3 years before I arrived, the route network would have been disrupted by substandard farming practices, and I never would have been able to construct the signal grammar. Your presence here was part of the contact event. The Bureau just can't quantify it, so they're going to ignore it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You don't need to make my case, Yara." "I know I don't need to," she said. She was looking at him with that direct, open steadiness that he had come to understand was simply the way she saw the world, without the protective layers most people use to make honesty more comfortable. "I'm doing it because it's true, and because—" She stopped, started again. "Because in 18 months on this station, I have had more real conversations with you than in the previous 4 years of my career combined. And because when I stood at that terminal, and I was honestly terrified down to my bones, knowing you were standing behind me made the fear workable." She paused. "I know you think you're too old for this kind of conversation." Cole looked at her. He felt something move in him, slow and tectonic, the way the largest changes always are, not fast, not dramatic, but complete. "I said you're too young for an old rancher," he said. It was not a denial. It was more like a clarification, naming the fear so that they could both see it clearly. Yara held his gaze with that same steadiness she had used to speak to something 1,000,000 years older than either of them. "To me," she said quietly, "you're perfect." The copper sun finished setting. The 2 moons rose, beginning their nightly chase across the indigo sky. The vessel in orbit continued its patient vigil, and somewhere beneath the red dust of Kessa 4, the route network continued its ancient conversation, patient and encoded and waiting for the right listener, as it always had been. Cole did not say anything for a long moment. The silence was not empty. It was a kind of silence that holds something, the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, without spilling. "The contact team will want you back in the research site," he said finally. "I know," said Yara. She did not move. "And I'll need to arrange transport off-world," he said. "Figure out what comes next." "I know," she said again. "Cole." She turned to look at him fully. "The Bureau has to approve a permanent science liaison to the contact site, someone who knows the terrain, the agricultural systems, the route network geography. Someone who has 3 years of direct observational data that no one else has." She let that sit for a moment. "I already submitted the recommendation. For you." Cole looked at her. He understood what she was offering. Not just a position, not just a practical solution to the problem of his displacement. She was offering him a reason to stay that was worth the complicated geometry of all the things he was afraid of and all the things he had been too tired to want for too long. He thought about the names he recited every night. He thought about whether those people, the ones he recited to keep the universe from forgetting, whether they would want to spend the rest of his life being careful. He did not think they would. "You're going to be insufferable to work with," he said. "All that reading things out loud that aren't in front of you yet. The corner of Yara's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something more complicated and more certain. You can complain about it, she said. Every morning. Above them, the moons chase each other across the sky. The root network pulsed with its ancient, patient signal. The universe, which had been keeping its records in life for longer than either of them could meaningfully imagine, continued doing what it had always done, attending to what mattered, holding the shape of it, making sure that nothing felt was entirely lost. Cole Harrow, 53 years old, iron-haired, frontier-worn, quietly extraordinary, looked out at the stars and felt something he had almost forgotten the shape of, returning to him like the sunrise, slow and certain,